Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's talk by Katharine Hayhoe. My name is Diana Wall, and I'm for the School of Law. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary, so this is one way we celebrate. Thanks to all of you. So effective. Really appreciate it. We're really pleased this afternoon to have a low-carbon lecture, interactive, with Katharine Hayhoe. For those of you who haven't read all about her, she is pretty amazing. As a bachelor student, she studied physics and astronomy, and then she met somebody who was a student of a person that many of us know in Boulder, and got carried away with climate change and the physics involved in climate change. She is an atmospheric scientist, a climate scientist. And now, after having finished her PhD, University of Illinois a number of years ago, her bachelor's was at the University of Toronto, she is now doing so much that she has won numerous awards. I really, I don't want to spend all the time, but she won the Steve Schneider Communications Award. She has been head or co-lead of many, many climate change reports for the U.S. government. She is a wonderful person to talk to about climate change. So we have that opportunity this afternoon. And so I'm going to turn it over to Katharine, who I think is up there.
I am here. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Now, just checking that you can hear me okay, right? Because your audio comes in and out a little bit, so I just want to make sure that you can hear everything I say, yes?
Yes.
Is everybody up there here? Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I am here. When I'm showing my slides, you'll see me in a little corner of the screen down there, and then we'll be back up big for questions again. Thank you so much for coming out to this lecture. I love giving low carbon lectures. I am so excited that when Diana invited me, I was able to ask her, could we do this? And she said yes. So I appreciate you coming out for this, because I think this really is a way that we can have conversations about climate change without actually contributing to the problem while we're doing it, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, right? So today I'm going to be talking about, here we go, about why climate change matters to us. And I want to get your feedback. So if you would, if you have a smartphone, an iPhone, or even your laptop with you, please go ahead and pull it out. I'm actually asking you to pull it out. Now you can put it on mute while you pull it out. That's probably a good idea. Pull out your phone or your laptop if you want to, and go to pollev.com/Texas Tech. Texas Tech is where I work. And it'll ask for your name, but you don't have to enter your name because anonymous is totally fine. Just skip that. I'm going to be using this to ask you questions, and we're actually going to see your response live on the screen. So again, pollev.com/Texas Tech. Give me a show of hands. Everything looking good there? All right, yes, I see hands go up. Great. Here is your first test. How do you feel about snow? Are you staying put until the avalanche is over? The more the better. Or do you prefer everything in moderation? One person has already voted. Oh, we got another vote here. All right, it looks like, ooh, the more the better is inching up. I have to confess that I do love snow. I am from Canada, so it's kind of genetic. Oh, the more the better is oh, it's at 40%. It's almost there. Oh, this is looking pretty close. So it is looking like almost a tie between everything in moderation versus the more the better. Well, this winter, I think that if you voted the B, the more the better, you're actually getting exactly what you wanted, aren't you? Yep, there we go. All right. So we're here, of course, ironically, to talk about global warming. There is no better day to talk about global warming than when there's a foot of snow outside, is there? And when someone says global warming to us, we hear a lot of things. Those of you who know me, you know I'm on social media. I do Twitter and Facebook and even Instagram. And so just about every single day, I have somebody saying something to me like, it's just a natural cycle. Or, we haven't studied this long enough to be totally sure. You scientists are making the whole thing up to line your pockets with government grants. Sea levels aren't rising, they're falling. In fact, as one notable commenter said to me, he said, sea levels lie. I thought, well, that's interesting. That's a very strong putting human characteristics on sea level. People say, oh, it's just a tiny amount of CO2 you're talking about. How could it make the entire planet warm? Well, it's just a tiny bit of white powder I put in your glass. Surely you're willing to drink it, right? And then, of course, between the months of November and April, the number one thing we hear is this. It is cold outside, so where's global warming now? Of course, the answer to that is it's winter. We hear politicians, we hear politicians saying things like, global warming, the debate is far from settled. Or, for everyone who thinks it's warming, I can find someone who says it isn't. Or, alarmist theories originate with scientists who operate outside the principles of the scientific method. But when we look at the social science, and this is a paper by Dan Kahan, I like to show you the pictures of people so you know who's talking. This is a picture of a paper that Dan Kahan did in 2012, so over 5 years ago. And he said, public apathy over climate change is often attributed to a deficit in comprehension. People don't know enough science. So if they don't know enough science, what's the answer? More science, right? But here's what he found, and this is why social science is so important, because it studies how we as humans interact with information. We conducted a study to test for this, and we found no support. In fact, people who had the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned, they were most polarized. And later work that he has done has showed basically that the smarter we are, the better we are at cherry picking just the pieces of information that we need to support our pre-existing views. Do people really have a problem with basic fluid dynamics? Do they really think that thermodynamics that we've known and used since the 1850s is false? No, if people truly had a problem with the basic science that underlies climate change, they would also have a problem with stoves, refrigerators, airplanes, and all the host of other objects we use almost every single day that employ the same laws of physics as our climate models do. It isn't really a genuine problem with the science. People don't really have a problem with the science. Now, I know that they sound like they do, but when you actually poll people and you look at the polling data, you see estimated percentage of adults who think global warming is happening. This is polling data from last year. Anything that is orange is more than 50%. Anything that is blue is less than 50%. There is only, I think, 3 counties on this entire map. If you have really good eyesight, you'll see them. One's in Utah, one's in West Virginia, and one is on the Georgia-Alabama border. So, or sorry, that Georgia-Mississippi. So people do agree global warming is happening. Now, it's true, a lower number of people would say it's mostly caused by humans. A lot of people still think it's natural cycles. But when you say, is global warming happening, most people will say yes. And then when you say, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Everybody says yes. In fact, the irony here is that even those 3 blue counties are orange here. So they might not think it's happening, but they do think it will harm plants and animals. Do you think global warming will harm future generations? Yes, pretty much everybody does. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? Now we're getting a little lighter colored here, but still the majority of the country is still orange. Now stay with me. Do you think global warming is already harming people in the US now or in the next 10 years? This is blue. In fact, even half of Colorado is blue. But this isn't the bluest map. I have one more. Do you think global warming is going to affect you personally? Look at that. This is our problem. Not the people who say it is or it isn't real, but the fact that we don't think it's going to affect us personally. Now, you may look at those few orange counties in New Mexico, in Texas, a few in Arizona and California, and you might say, well, why are those few counties orange? The most concerned people group in the United States about a changing climate is Hispanic Catholics. So I think that might have something to do with it. So again, this is the number of people who think global warming is mostly caused by human activities. This is the science. This is the number who think it matters. This is our problem. We don't think it matters. Because if you agree with the science or if you don't agree with the science, if you don't think it matters, you're not going to do anything about it. You're not going to vote for politicians who do. Why is that? I'm going to ask you another question. If you had a book or a movie cover that you had to design and you had to put an image or a picture on it, what image or picture do you think most people would pick to put on a book about global warming? A textbook about climate change? A movie about the impacts? All right, melting glacier. Aha. Polar bear. Yes, you have hit it on the nose. People would pick a polar bear or an iceberg. Now, realistically, how many people have seen a polar bear in real life with their own eyeballs in the wild? Very few of us, right? So here we have this global issue that's going to affect the lives of every single person on this earth. And the number one image is an animal that few of us have seen that lives very far away. A polar bear on an iceberg, usually looking sad. If we do see a picture with people in it, the picture usually looks something like this. A picture of people living very far away from us on low-lying islands in the South Pacific, nowhere near where we live ourselves. So the most dangerous myth we've bought into is the myth that climate change doesn't matter. It's a distant issue. It only matters to future generations or to people or places or animals or plants that live far away. But in reality, climate change matters to us. And so my favorite picture is this one, because this is one lone little iceberg floating in the ocean as it melts. And who's on the iceberg? People. We are the ones at risk from a changing climate. So why does climate change matter to us? Well, we know that we have weather. It can be cold, it can be hot, it can be wet, it can be dry. But climate is the long-term average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. Climate is what we use to design our building codes and build our buildings and our homes. Climate is what determines what type of crops we can grow, where and when and how. Climate determines where our flood zones are. And climate even is used as input to our long-term water planning. This is where I live in Lubbock, Texas. It is very flat. The only types of mountains we have are upside-down mountains, canyons. We actually have quite big canyons. Right off the top of this map is the second biggest canyon in the United States. It's called Palo Duro Canyon. But because it's flat, our roads are very straight. And they are so straight that you could be driving a ways up Highway 87, staying not just on the highway, but even in your own lane if you're looking in the rearview mirror. Why? Because where you were 5 seconds ago, 30 seconds ago, heck, even 10 minutes ago, where you were is a perfect predictor of where you'll be in the future because the road is dead straight. But just at the top of this map, there is one giant curve on the road with a row of concrete grain silos on that curve. What happens if you are driving up the road looking in the rearview mirror? I hope you know the answer to that. Let's just say you will end up somewhere you did not plan to be. Planning for the future based on the past is like driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror. It works great when climate is stable, as it has largely been over the course of human civilization on this planet. But when climate is changing, and the faster it changes, the worse this is, we have to take our eyes off the rearview mirror. We have to look ahead into the future to make sure that we make it around this curve. That's why climate change matters to us. We know today that that long-term average is changing. And even worse, we know that that change is also affecting our variability. In many cases, our variability is increasing too. And that matters to us because we are vulnerable to weather and climate extremes already. So why do we care about a changing climate? Because, as the US military says, it's a threat multiplier. It takes the extremes that we are already vulnerable to today and it makes them stronger. It amplifies them. It exacerbates them. This is a map of the number of weather and climate events that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage since 1980. Now, Texas is already number one because Texas gets every type of impact you can imagine, from droughts to hailstorms to ice storms to, yes, hurricanes. But Colorado's up there. Colorado has a fair number of these events. These events are already affecting us naturally, but we care about a changing climate because it is exacerbating or amplifying many of these extremes. So now I want to ask you a question. You've lived in Colorado. What crazy weather event have you experienced? When you answer, please connect your words so they will stay together. So use like a little dash or something in between your words if you don't mind, if you're using multiple words. If you're only using one word, then just put in the word. So what crazy weather event have you experienced in Colorado? Okay, we have hail. Oh, the Boulder flood. That was a bad one. Blizzard, drought, fire, extreme heat, snowstorm, snow in May. Yes, I've experienced that too. Flash floods, 4-foot snow. Oh my goodness. Drought, no snow, hailstorms, forest fires. I think you guys have a pretty good idea of what weather and climate extremes look like. This is a very comprehensive list. So you know how these things affect us in the places where we live. And so you can understand why it matters when I say that climate change is loading the dice against us. We already have a set of dice that have 6s on them and 5s and 4s and 3s. And any given year, we have a chance of rolling a double 5 or a double 6, a really crazy drought or heavy snowfall or a hailstorm or wildfire. But what climate change is doing is it's sneaking in decade by decade, and it's taking one of those numbers and replacing it with a 6. So all of a sudden, our chances of rolling a double 6 are going up over time. And then we roll a 7, and we think, where did the 7 come from? That's how climate change is loading the dice against us. I'm a lead author on the U.S. National Climate Assessment. Volume 2 was just released this past November on Black Friday, so it's called the Black Friday Climate Report often. You can find it online yourself at nca2018.globalchange.gov. And it is a great resource that talks about how climate change is already affecting each region of the United States. Colorado is in the southwest region in this report, so if you want the info specifically about Colorado, go to the southwest chapter. They also have chapters on water, energy, infrastructure, health, tribes, and more. Let me give you a couple of highlights, though, from Volume 2 to show how climate change is loading the dice against us. Volume 2 is enormous. I do not recommend reading it from cover to cover. Just pick the pieces that are interesting to you. It is over 1,600 pages long. But it talks about how we're being affected today, how the impacts will get worse in the future, and most importantly, how we are responding to these changes. If I could summarize all 1,600 pages in 3 sentences, this is what I would say. Climate change is not a distant issue anymore. It's affecting every single one of us in every part of the U.S. across almost every sector. And the more climate changes, the more serious and even dangerous the impacts will become. Like what? Well, first of all, we're seeing that extreme heat is becoming more frequent. This is a figure that compares the ratio of the number of low temperature records we break every year to the number of high temperature records we break every year. If climate isn't changing, we'd be breaking on average about the same number every year. Last year, we broke about 10,000 cold temperature records. So people might say, 10,000 cold temperature records? How can you say the planet is warming? Well, it's because we broke about 35,000 high temperature records. So our variability is changing, and we are seeing more extreme highs than lows. We're also seeing more extreme precipitation. especially in the Midwest and the Northeast. This is what's already happened since the 1950s, but we're seeing it across the entire US because warmer air holds more water vapor. So more water vapor there is sitting there. When a storm comes along naturally, as it always does, it sweeps up that water vapor and it dumps it on us. That's why we're seeing an increase in heavy precipitation, both rain and snow. Along the west coast, all the way up to Canada, they get these things called atmospheric rivers. They are rivers of water vapor tracking across the Pacific that when they hit the coast and the air starts to rise, they dump their water. We expect these extreme landfalling storms to become stronger and more frequent in the future, and we also expect hurricanes to become more damaging. Now, we don't actually see a trend in the number of hurricanes, and we don't expect more of them in the future. A lot of people often say, oh, well, there's no change in the numbers, so how can you say they're getting worse? It's because we're still getting the same number, but the ones we get are getting worse. They're stronger, they're slower, they're bigger, they intensify faster, and they have a lot more rainfall associated with them now than they would have had 50 or 100 years ago. In fact, it's estimated for Hurricane Harvey that as much as 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey would not have fallen if the same hurricane had occurred 100 years ago. That's a lot of damages. Hurricane Harvey cost about $125 billion worth of damages, and more than 40% of those damages would have been avoided if they hadn't had so much rain. We've seen hurricanes wreak havoc across the islands. We've seen that so-called sunny day or nuisance flooding has increased by a factor of 10 for some small towns along the Atlantic coast. So this is flooding that doesn't occur with a storm. It's just occurring with high tide plus sea level rise. In Louisiana, there are already climate refugees. Native Americans who live on the coast have lived on the coast for a very long time, and as their land is sinking and sea level is rising, they are having to abandon their homes already today. This is not a future issue. In California, just over a year ago, they broke the record for the largest wildfire, the wildfire that had burned the most area on record. Well, that record was smashed that following summer, and you know what happened this past fall. This isn't just Colorado. Across the entire western U.S., including Colorado, it isn't just California. Across the whole U.S., including Colorado, wildfire is a normal and natural way of life. So in other words, there's that pair of double sixes is already on the dice when it comes to wildfire in Colorado. But as climate changes, those numbers, there's more sixes on the dice and there's even the occasional 7. So now about twice the area is being burned by wildfire across the western U.S. than would be burned without a changing climate. That's how it's loading the dice against us. Right here in Colorado, these are some of the headlines that accompanied the National Climate Assessment, as well as looks at water resources this year and last year. So the response to the National Climate Assessment was, climate change clobbers Colorado and the West, unfurling fire, dangerous insects, and heat. Above average snowpack is not quite enough to melt the drought worries. A lack of snow is affecting mountain snowpack. So you see that the variability is changing. So we have drier conditions, and then we have wetter conditions, then we have even drier conditions, and we have even wetter conditions. The dice are really getting loaded against us no matter where we live. Up in Alaska, where homes, buildings, transportation networks, even oil pipelines are built on what used to be permanently frozen ground that is now thawing and crumbling. In the islands, where all kinds of important infrastructure, hotels, homes, buildings, cities, airports, historical monuments, irreplaceable locations, they are located within just a few feet of sea level. The bottom line is we care about a changing climate because it exacerbates the risks that we already face today, no matter where we live. So here's the question for you again. When it comes to climate change, what is your biggest concern? You can answer with one word, or you can connect your words again, or just run them together if you want to. But when it comes to climate change, what are you most worried about? What are you concerned that it's going to affect? Future, yes. Children, Water availability, that's huge. Food security, grandchildren. Coral, social change. Most concerned that it's too late to do anything about it, yes. Our food, access to clean water. I like this one. Everything. Absolutely. And I love that somebody said liberty there, because the interesting thing is that the more disasters befall a given region or a country, the more likely people are to give more power to the government, ending up in a totalitarian state. So whoever said liberty, you're actually right on the nose in terms of what political theory says. So look at what we've got here. We've got food, water, children, and our future, and wildlife right there in the middle. This isn't about, caring only about the environment. This is about caring about every living thing that lives on this planet, and we will be affected in ways that matter. Personally, I like that there's skiing in there too. So this is the Prime Minister of Dominica, one of the islands that was hit in the 2017 hurricane season and just about wiped out. And when he spoke to the United Nations later that fall, he said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. And we're starting to see a change in public opinion. In January, the Yale Program on Climate Communication that produced those maps that I showed you, they released their latest update, and they found record levels of concern. They have never seen jumps this fast before in over 10 years of data keeping. And so they asked me why that might be, and I said, well, I think there's a couple of different reasons, but one of the reasons is because today nearly every single person can point to a way that they are personally affected, whereas 10 to 20 years ago, we couldn't do that. So we're starting to turn this thing around in terms of recognizing it's important, but we have to do a lot more than that. So what can we do about it? This is where the title of this talk comes from. It comes from a quote by John Holdren, who was the science advisor under President Obama's administration. And John said this, he said, we have three choices. Mitigation, which is reducing our carbon emissions that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. Adaptation, which means building resilience and preparing for a changing climate. And suffering. We will do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be, because the more we reduce our emissions, the less we have to prepare for a different future, and the less suffering there will be. So it isn't a case of, I want to pick one of these things. Unfortunately, we have to pick all three, but we want to try to minimize the suffering, and that means maximizing the mitigation and the adaptation. So what does this look like? Let me give you some pictures of what this looks like. Let's start with adaptation. What does adaptation look like here? Well, I work a lot with cities. I've worked with Boulder. I've worked with other cities around the country. And one of the first cities I worked with was the city of Chicago. So what we did was we went in and we sat down with people in the city and we said, what are the ways that your dice are already turning up double sixes? What are the double sixes that you worry about? Flooding was one of the first ones that came to the top of the list. Potholes was actually another one. The problem with the south side of Chicago, when it got really hot, there was fires, there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of health emergencies. The Chicago Transit Authority was worried about when it got really hot, their rails on the trains would warp, and so they couldn't run the trains anymore. We found 14 out of the 18 city departments identified ways that they were already being hit by double sixes. And then what we did was we took these different thresholds. The Chicago Metro cared about 92 degrees. The Department of Emergency Services, they staffed by the thermometer over 94 degrees. Potholes, you care about crossing the freeze-thaw barrier. We looked at the type of trees they'd be planting. We looked at the energy demand for the school district. We looked at when they would be timing their summer festivals, because Chicago has a lot of outdoor summer festivals. And then what did they do? I was curious, so I just followed up after we did the study for them, waited a couple of years, and I started looking, what had they done? Well, new sewers quickly dispatch heavy rains. Massive new reservoir helps alleviate Chicago area flooding. They're worried about extreme heat. They're putting in green roofs. Green roofs lower the urban heat island effect and also lower their energy costs. In Texas, we never have enough water, and so people are transitioning from pivot irrigation, which loses a lot of water because it evaporates before it hits the ground, and it might not even get to the ground. They're moving from that to drip irrigation, so they can still irrigate their crops with a fraction of the water. In the Netherlands, they're very concerned about sea level rise. They're building floating villages. So if sea level rises 2 or 3 or 4 feet, they just have to go get a bit more anchor chain. What does adaptation look like in Colorado? Colorado is one of the leaders in incorporating climate projections into their water plans. Denver Water is one of the leaders in this area, as well as the state, doing snowpack projections and making sure that their long-term water plans actually account for a changing climate. Things like flood mitigation, ensuring there's riparian zones, green leafy zones, alongside rivers so that when those rivers flood, you won't have buildings in the floodplain, and you will also have vegetation and soil that can soak up that water much more easily than concrete and buildings. What does mitigation look like? Well, we have a ways to go on mitigation. This is our annual carbon dioxide emissions by state, and yes, Texas is #1. But what does mitigation look like in Texas? You might be surprised. It turns out in Texas has the biggest army base in the US, and they went with wind and solar energy 2 years ago because they crunched the numbers, and they would save $165 million of taxpayer money compared to using natural gas in Texas. Every year in spring, when it's windiest, we break a new wind energy record, and now, as of 2018, we're up to 19.2% of our electricity in the state of Texas coming from wind and solar energy. There's entire towns going green. The town of Georgetown, just north of Austin, was the first one to do it, but the entire city of Dallas is now run off clean energy. Now, that doesn't mean every single home. Georgetown is already on every single home, but all of city operations in Dallas are run off clean energy as well. Dallas. Now, people often say, what about China? And it's true, China burns a lot of coal. And a few years ago, their carbon emissions on an annual basis overtook those of the United States. Now, they didn't do so on a cumulative basis. They still have a very long way to go to overtake the US in terms of cumulative emissions, as well as in terms of per capita emissions. They are nowhere near emissions per person. But as a country, they overtook the US a few years ago in terms of the most carbon emissions produced every year. But they also have more wind and solar energy than any other country in the US, including the US. The headline 2 years ago was that they would be spending $360 billion on clean energy by next year. What other mitigation can we talk about? We can talk about not just what enormous countries are doing, we can talk about what we ourselves are doing. Eating lower down the food chain is one of the most important ways that we as individuals can reduce our carbon footprint. I know light bulbs are kind of boring, but they're pretty cheap now, LED light bulbs, and they really do cut our bills. Then there's cool new technology like solar shingles and electric cars. I do have a plug-in car, and when we first got it, we had it plugged in outside because we didn't have an outlet in the garage. And every single neighbor on our street in Texas stopped, got out of their car, walked around, and said, "What is that? Does it have a gas pedal?" We had great conversation over the fact that this was a really cool car, and I was saving a ton of money on gas because our electricity here is very cheap. The biggest part of my own carbon footprint is my travel. And so I spend a ton of time trying to figure out how I can consolidate multiple events into one place and transition now. I think I'm up to 80%, thanks to you guys, of my presentations, virtual presentations, low carbon presentations online. I love it because I'm reducing my carbon footprint at the same time as we're talking about climate change. I love talking about what unexpected communities are doing. Universities putting solar panels on the basketball stadium, churches putting solar panels on the roof. Organizations like Fresh Energy in Minnesota that are looking at ways to use solar farms to reduce soil erosion and to plant pollinator-friendly plants to create habitat for insects, bees, and butterflies. How fantastic is that? It's estimated that if farmers take a small percentage of their land and put solar panels on that small percentage, they could easily make the equivalent of their average yield. Here in Texas, I think it's about 10% of their land. A recent statistic I saw for Illinois, where it's a lot colder and grayer in the winter, was an even smaller part of their land. So this provides a possible way for farmers to actually generate their own crop insurance. When the crops fail, you still sell your energy. Walmart is the richest company in the world, and they are going to be 50% clean energy by 2025. Apple's about number 10 or 11, and they're already 100% clean energy, and they're decarbonizing their supply chain. Businesses are doing this. I love talking about what unexpected places in the world are doing, like Morocco has the biggest solar farm in the world. The UK has the biggest offshore wind farm in the world. Of course, as I already mentioned, China has more wind and solar put together than any other country. But this is also happening in unexpected places, in places where hundreds of millions of people live who don't have access to electricity of any kind, where the only source of energy is kerosene, which is very expensive. These places are being revolutionized by new microfinancing plans and companies and nonprofits who are going in and trying to figure out ways to get people the energy they need without building massive transmission systems, huge multi-billion-dollar plants, and putting them in debt to other countries because they do not have their own fossil fuels and they would have to buy them elsewhere. You may be familiar with Project Drawdown, and if you aren't, I encourage you to check it out because it is an incredibly hopeful list. You can find it online at drawdown.org. It's an incredibly hopeful list of over 100 solutions to climate change, and some of these solutions are things that you would not expect. Number 6 on the list is educating girls in developing countries. Then you've got regenerative agriculture, peatlands, afforestation, conservation agriculture. Yes, you have the standard wind turbines, solar farms, nuclear power, geothermal, but it's a holistic picture that actually helps us conserve our water resources, grow our food, work in developing countries, put carbon back in the soil where it's actually good for us and we want that carbon back in the soil, and help other people too. I love talking about how there's all kinds of solutions. There's solutions from the left side of the spectrum and the right side of the spectrum, and there's bipartisan solutions too. There's conservative solutions, and the fact is, many Bush-era conservatives actually support a price on carbon like is currently being considered in a bill that was introduced to the House in November. I know there's a lot of talk about the Green New Deal, but what a lot of people don't realize is the Green New Deal is not a bill yet, but the Energy and Innovation Act is a bill, and it's proposing to put a price on carbon, and it is before the House right now, introduced by a bipartisan team of Republicans and Democrats. It might be the only bill that was. There's libertarian solutions to climate change. I'm not a libertarian, but I enjoy telling people, hey, if you are, go here because there are libertarian solutions. And here's the really good news. Remember those maps I showed you? Look at this map. This is the reddest map. Do you support funding research into renewable energy? 80 to 100% of people say yes. Now, do you support tax rebates for people who purchase energy-efficient vehicles or solar panels? Yes. What's up with Texas? I'm not sure about that, but I'm working on changing that. Now, this is kind of crazy. Do you support taxing fossil fuel companies? Now, tax is that evil 3-letter word. Do you support taxing fossil fuel companies while reducing other taxes so individuals are not harmed? This is essentially the bill that is currently before the House. It turns out that just about everybody does support this. Could you believe it? So this is encouraging. People do care about solutions and they support them. But I can't leave it here though because there's one more word we have to look at. And that one more word is not a good word. That word is suffering, and that word relates to what we're already seeing happen today and what we'll see much more of if we do not act to mitigate and adapt. What does suffering look like? Well, we know what it looks like here as we're impacted by extreme weather events. But what we have to recognize is that people who live in poverty today, people who live on $1 or $2 a day, people who spend everything they have trying to feed their family, who don't have access to clean water, who are dying of diseases that nobody should be dying from in 2019. Those are the people who are disproportionately affected by a changing climate. They are the ones who are already suffering, and that's not fair. We are all vulnerable to a changing climate through heat waves in India, hurricanes in the Caribbean, floods across Southeast Asia, wildfires across the US West. Whether we live in North America or Bangladesh, whether we live in Texas or Syria, climate change is loading the dice against us. And in one place, in Texas, we have crop insurance. We have savings in the bank. When hurricanes come, we have the National Guard. You don't have those things if you're a farmer in Syria or somebody living in a city in Bangladesh. That's why the suffering is greater. Because wherever we live, heat waves, hurricanes, coastal storms, floods, wildfires, heavy rain events, they affect us all. And we care about it because climate change is the hole in the bucket. We're trying to put all of our resources into buckets to help fix poverty and disease and hunger. But climate change is the whole. We can't fix these things if we leave climate change out of the picture. So we have three choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We have to do the first two as much as we can, because only then can we avoid the suffering that would otherwise follow. To take you back to the road, we need to plan for that curve in the road. We need to look ahead to the future. We need to do what we can to make that curve as least extreme as we can through mitigation. But at the same time, we have to build resilience to the curve that is going to happen no matter what, to make sure that we make it around that curve together. And to do that, we don't just need a vision of the apocalyptic future that will ensue if we fail. We need a vision of hope. We need a picture of a better future to strive towards, something that will end us up in a better place, not a worse place than we are today. So that's why I want to ask you my last question. When it comes to climate change, not what are you most worried about, but what gives you hope? What keeps you going? What makes you feel like, yes, we can do this thing? This is the biggest question that I get myself. And this is a bit different. This is not a Wordle, so you can type in multiple words if you want to. I love this. What gives you hope? Education, unification, yes. Technology, absolutely. Hearing about new ways to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into fuel. Figuring out ways to plow carbon back into our soils. Looking at ways to grow our energy, like I said, from solar shingles on our roofs, or even fabric, or from roads themselves. Technology really does offer hope. Young minds and students, I love that. I don't know if you know, I have a series called Global Weirding that's on YouTube, and my favorite episode on Global Weirding is called I'm Just One Kid, What Can I Do? If you need a shot of hope in the arm, go watch that episode on kids. Global Weirding on YouTube. I love this. Working together as a global community, innovation, love, research, the scientific community. People, yes, I love that too. People are actually what give me hope, talking to people. I'm not sure what soju says. You'll have to spell that one out. Collaboration, yes, and engaging youth, absolutely. And our youth really are becoming engaged. This is fantastic. So when it comes to climate change, remember I showed you this blue map. This is the percent of people who think global warming will harm them. Now, there is one map that is actually bluer. Any guesses on what that is? The absolute bluest map is, do you ever talk about it? Nobody talks about it. Why? Because maybe we're concerned, might start a fight, might just be depressing. I don't know how it's relevant. Well, you know what? You are now equipped to talk about it. If you want more, I have a whole TED Talk that I just did in December. You can find it online. The whole TED Talk is about how do I have these conversations with people that are meaningful, that are positive, that are constructive, that actually take us to a better place. Those conversations don't focus on the science. They focus on what climate change means to me in the places where I live and what we can do by working together to fix it. And the conversations end with hope rather than despair. So the most important thing that we can do, the bottom line is, we need to talk about this thing, because that is what we're not doing. We are not talking about it, and so follow the dots here. If we're not talking about it, why would we care? If we don't care, why would we do anything to fix it and support people who do? Talking about it is one of the most important things we can do because our threat-o-meter is out of balance. We think the climate solutions are all about decreasing our quality of life, heading towards a worse world, not being able to shower, not being able to drive, not being able to eat what I want or do what I like. And we think the impacts are far off. We need to rebalance our threat-o-meter. The impacts are here today and they affect us, but there are solutions that get rid of some of the stuff we don't need. I mean, really, did a million plastic toys ever make somebody permanently happy? We get rid of the stuff that we don't need, but we have more of the good stuff that we do need. Working together for cleaner air, cleaner water, green jobs, livable cities. This is my favorite cartoon. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing, right? Thank you. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to take audience questions, but we're also going to take questions here. So we're going to alternate between you ask a question live or you can ask a question on the screen, and I will go back and forth between the two. Except we have a tiny little problem. I can't hear anything. Now I can.
Anybody have questions?
You can type entire sentences here for your questions online.
Hi, Katharine. This is Apathy. I'm so excited to have you here for all of the kind information that I am one of the students of Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. I did masters in Texas University. I watched an interview you have given last week with Previous News, and you mentioned that it's new faith for which you are a climate scientist. Can you please explain more how can faith help us to mitigate or adapt to climate change? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm sorry to say that the microphone was so loud that I could only hear every other word. So if you don't mind, if somebody doesn't mind just restating without the microphone, as a climate scientist, what was the second part of that sentence?
Faith is what he was asking.
Oh, about faith. Oh, okay. Good. I did not catch that at all. So thank you. So in the future, don't worry about the microphone. I can actually hear you guys great. And by the way, I can see every single face too, which is awesome. So this is not something I thought of myself, but I think this is a great description of it. Science is a map. It tells us which way is north and south, east and west, but it's not a compass. It can't tell us what's the right way to go. So with science, it can tell us that climate is changing, humans are responsible. It can tell us that the impacts are serious, and it can even quantify the extent to which they're dangerous. And science can tell us that the window of time to act is closing fast. But how do we decide what to do? That comes more from our heart than from our head. And so for many of us, for 80% of people around the world, I think about over 75% of people in the US, many of our values come from our faith, values of being good stewards of the earth. That's not an exclusively Christian value. In fact, I think every major world religion has that value in one shape or another. The idea of caring for our people who are less fortunate than us. That's actually a basic human value. It's very hard. Occasionally you can, but it's hard to meet somebody who wouldn't have compassion on somebody else who is suffering. So to fix this thing, we need science, we need data, we need facts, but we also have to engage our heart. Because working together with our head and our heart, that's how we can fix this thing. All right, let me share my screen again because I think we've got some questions coming in here. Just a second. Okay, we do have a question, and actually I think we have a couple of questions, which is great. Fantastic questions. I love this. Okay. To what extent do you think that changing the design of our cities and our buildings will help? I think that'll help a lot, especially the cities, because suburbs contribute enormously to our transportation footprint. And as of last year, I think transportation has become the #1 sector producing carbon emissions in the United States. So smart design, and again, I really love that word smart, because who likes to spend 2 hours a day in a car? I mean, I know there's a few people who do, but most of us don't. Smart design can really make a big difference in our homes, in our buildings, and in the way we design and redesign our cities. This is fantastic. We have a ton of questions here. I'm going to take a couple more of these, and then we'll go back to the audience. Let's see. Have I found that my faith has broken down barriers for people? It absolutely has. And the reason why I actually started talking about my faith was because I found myself speaking to audiences in the South where they viewed me as very different than them. They felt like they couldn't identify with me at all. And I realized, hey, well, if I'm going to show how, we are people who care about a changing climate, I'm going to have to say, hey, here's how we connect. So starting that conversation with what we most have in common, whether we are skiers or birders or hikers or parents or farmers or Christians, starting that conversation with what we most agree on is the most important step to making sure that conversation goes in a positive direction. And in my TED Talk, I talk a lot more specifically about that. Let's see. Do I have a format or a site or a resource that I recommend for teaching kids? Great question. So there's a lot of good resources that NASA has online for kids, but I do recommend our global weirding videos for kids. They aren't specifically aimed at kids, but they're super short, they're really basic, they've got some cartoons in them, and a lot of people report that they are using our global weirding episodes in school because they really are accessible for any age. Okay. What about those who profit from denial? That's really hard. So, I talked about how Walmart is the richest company in the world. Well, if you look at the top 10 list, the rest of it is filled with companies who have made their trillions of dollars from either extracting, processing, or building things that use fossil fuels. So we are talking about a massive redistribution in the balance of power and wealth in this world that we have not witnessed since the end of slavery. But just as slavery ended, so too must the fossil fuel era, because the poor and the vulnerable in this world are again disproportionately suffering. Many are worried that big government is the solution and this is a power grab. Absolutely. I hear that all the time. That's why talking solutions is so important. Talking solutions that appeal to people from their side of the political spectrum. Solutions that grow the local economy, that build local jobs, that save us money, and that actually help people become more independent, more resilient, and stronger. Okay, let's take a live question now. These questions are fantastic. Keep them going. We'll go back to it, but let's take another live question. Don't use the microphone, though.
Hi, Katharine. Thanks for the talk. My question was submitted actually via text as well, but I wanted to ask you, you talked about the importance of talking about climate change. And in your presentation, you used the term climate change and global warming sort of interchangeably. Do you have a recommendation on which one should be used? Could you talk about the semantics there and kind of the differences?
I absolutely can, and my husband is a linguist. So we have some fun Scrabble games, and I'm sorry to say that I usually lose. So I prefer climate change because global warming is the increase in the temperature of the average planet, the increase in the average temperature of the planet, which is the most visible and obvious symptom to scientists, but it is not to us as individuals. I mean, an increase of 1 degree C in the average temperature of the planet is never something that we individually will be able to personally experience in our lives. What we experience in our lives is we experience global weirding, the dice being loaded against us, crazy stuff happening that we know isn't normal, and we also experience climate change, which includes many different aspects, not just getting warmer, but changes in rainfall patterns, changes in snow patterns, changes in the severity and the frequency of storms. There's a lot more to this picture than simply global warming, and so I feel like climate change is a more inclusive term that doesn't just refer to the average temperature of the planet increasing, but is really the total package of things getting weirder. All right, let's take another in-person question. There's one up there I can see. Oh, maybe there's two.
Okay. Hi, Katharine. Thank you for the talk. So, that was the last time when I was doing my research, I saw some people avoid of these, it's better that I don't know than to know, right? Because they are afraid, they are scared, and all that. So my question, I want to ask you, if seeking out climate change information can actually motivate people to be. Okay, my question is, if seeking climate change information can actually motivate people to engage with the issue of climate change.
Aha, okay, I got that now. Sorry, the microphone cuts out a little bit sometimes. So the Yale program on climate communication is looking at this, but I don't think they have data quite yet. But what the indications are, at least from my own personal sample size, which includes several thousand people, is that talking about the science is often not enough to motivate people. In fact, talking about the science makes us feel like just sometimes going back to bed and pulling the covers over our heads. I mean, I feel like that myself sometimes. What motivates us to act is hope. And what gives us hope is understanding that there are already millions of hands on that boulder. That boulder is already at the top of the hill. It is starting to roll downhill. It just has to go faster. And to do that, we need more hands on it. So talking about what people are already doing, what we can do ourselves, the difference that we can make in the world, and what we can vote on, which is also really important. As somebody once said, it's more important to change a politician than a light bulb when it comes to climate change. I can't take credit for that one either. But what motivates us to act is the hope that we can make a difference. And so that's why talking about actions are so important. That's what makes us feel like, yes, it is possible. Fantastic question. Was there another one kind of over here?
This one, John went to.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. Katharine, my name is John Sanderson. I work with the Nature Conservancy, Colorado. I talk about this topic every single and I'm also presenting a similar talk as yours, not nearly, learned a lot, took a lot of notes, thank you today. But what I'm curious about is, do you modify your presentation based on the demographic that you're speaking? Universities, conservatives, older, younger. And what are some of the principles you follow in adjusting your presentation?
Well, I have some bad news for you, and that is that I never give the same presentation twice. But what I do is I have templates. So I have about 15 templates of different presentations that are appropriate for different audiences. And then before I give a given presentation, I pull up the template, like for this presentation here, and then I modify it, usually about 20% based on who people are, where they live. I often do presentations that are even more specific to certain geographic locations. Also, what's in the news? I mean, sometimes, you know, I talk a lot more about weather and snow and how climate change is affecting winter storms. So it's kind of a combination of who we're talking to, what we're interested in the moment, where we live, because regional impacts is really important, but starting off with a few templates, because it would be absolutely insane to try to design presentations from scratch every single time. And I should add, I'm going to be speaking at the Nature Conservancy's annual meeting in June.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, let's go back to the slide because I think there's probably a couple more questions. Let's see if we can answer a few more questions then. Just a second here. Let's go to share my screen. Oops.
Wait.
Oh, wait, okay.
No,
I was going to ask the question in regards to building our way out of this. Every time I look at that, I build windmills and et cetera, et cetera. We need to build those in 6 to 10 years. We're gonna burn up a lot. So the question is, build our way out, or do we have to slow down and realize that there's another way to live on this? Not have to work 40 hours a week, at least most of us should, and we should do more time helping others, playing cards, whatever.
Hiking. We should spend more time hiking. Yes and yes. The answer to your question is a double yes. So the low-hanging fruit when it comes to cutting our carbon emissions is something hardly anybody ever talks to. And in fact, I should really add more about this to my own presentation. I think I will after this. Efficiency. We are so wasteful with the energy that we have and that we use. And so reducing our energy use, the first thing we can do is efficiency. Energy, retrofitting our homes, retrofitting our buildings where we work, our businesses, our schools, reducing our energy consumption first of all, and then replacing what we can't reduce with clean sources. Now, here in Texas, they actually are building wind turbines as fast as you envision. Every time I drive south of Lubbock, where I live, there's a new giant wind or solar farm going up. I mean, it is insane. And this is, not even half of what they're doing in China. So the building is happening, and the building is happening predominantly, actually, in a lot of areas that don't have access to electricity, too. So that's a big area of expansion. But efficiency is really important. And ultimately, again, recognizing that there's a lot of things in our lives that we don't need. We don't need that 2-hour commute. We don't need, all of those things that we thought would make us happy but never did. What we need is what we often miss. I mean, when they do studies of what people are missing, they're missing a sense of community. They're missing connecting with their neighbors. They're missing their families. They're missing connections with people. As I say, when you die, they're not going to write your professional accomplishments on your tombstone. They're going to write what you meant to the people you love. And so I think we really are talking about not just an energy revolution, but a heart revolution. But I think they're going to have to happen together because we really do need both. All right, well, I don't want to keep anybody too long. Should I answer a couple more online questions or?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll do another couple more online questions. Okay, if you need to leave, don't worry. I can see you leaving, but that's a totally don't feel guilty at all. All right. So let me share my screen here again, and let's see what else we have in the way of questions. Here we go. Give it a second here. What are trends regarding public acceptance of climate change? Well, it's actually quite positive. Even the majority of Republicans accept that climate is changing, and the vast majority of Americans accept that climate is changing and humans are responsible. Now, when I talk to conservative audiences, I use an ICE Corps record that actually goes back 6,000 years. 6,000 years is actually a very useful amount of time because that's the history of human civilization on this planet. And it really shows clear as day that over the course of human civilization, we have not seen changes like this. And so I often say to agree that climate is changing due to human activities, we don't have to agree the planet is any more than 300 years old. And most of us agree on that. So this is a question that I saw before I didn't get a chance to answer. What would you recommend for a beginner sustainable scientist in the way of internships and job opportunities? Well, there are a lot of opportunities out there. There's internships with scientific societies in DC if you're interested in legislation and policy. There are increasingly internships at the state level with and even starting to be with corporations too. So there's a lot. And what I would suggest is plugging into an organization that brings together people that you're interested in. So a sustainable business organization, a sustainable farming organization, a climate resilience preparation, water preparation organization. There's a lot of organizations that I would suggest getting to know, attend their meeting, plug in, get to know them, start asking around and making yourself available because there really is a lot going on. Please tell us about the countries with the greenest buildings in the world. Well, I'm not exactly sure which countries those are, but there are some amazing buildings in Europe that have the entire side of a multi-floor apartment building is living. It is just living plants. How cool is that? I would love to live in a building like that. Let's see. Let's pick one more question. Okay. On Drawdown.org, managed grazing was on the list. So reducing meat consumption is also on the list. How plant-based diet specifically. How do we best support our ranchers while also eating more veggies? I'm going to answer this question. This is going to be the last one because this is very near and dear to my heart because I live in Texas. And if you think people care about meat in Colorado, trust me, they care about it a lot more in Texas. So I'm really excited that at our university, there are researchers looking at how sustainable grazing, rather than factory farming, sustainable grazing can actually put carbon back in the soil. The meat tastes a bit different and it's going to cost a lot more, but it can be sustainable from a carbon perspective. Now, it doesn't fix the methane issue, but there are things like seaweed, it turns out, that a cheap farmer in Nova Scotia, or PEI actually, discovered he fed the seaweed to his cows and it eliminated their methane emissions. So they're looking at growing the seaweed at scale because if you could feed these seaweed supplements to cows that improves their digestion, reduces their methane emissions, then you have free-range grazing, you have almost entirely eliminated the carbon emissions associated, the heat trapping gas emissions associated with livestock. But you're not going to be able to produce as much meat, not nearly as much meat, only about 10% of the meat, because it requires a lot more land to do the grazing. So the meat will be more expensive. But that's a way that we can still keep some meat and support ranchers and help them continue to make their livelihood off that meat while continuing to reduce our carbon emissions. So thank you so much. This has been so fun. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it.